Hello, my name is Dina Lopez, and today I am going to share with you some research I have done on Puerto Rico's liminal existence. This is for Research Methods 5363 at Texas Tech University with Doctors Michael Ferris and Rebecca Rickley, and it is December 3rd, 2019. Before I get into the general subject of my research, I would like to give you a little bit of historical and political background of Puerto Rico. So during the Spanish-American War, there was a ship that was docked off of the coast of Havana, Cuba, the USS Maine. The USS Maine exploded. Spain blamed the United States for doing that just to cause problems during the war. The United States blamed Spain, but the end result was the Treaty of Paris in 1898. In that treaty, Puerto Rico and 15 other territories were acquired, and these territories went from Spanish possession to United States territory. Puerto Rico is, the Spanish term was Estado Libre Asociado, and that is still the term used in Spanish today on the island. However, no self-respecting Puerto Rican would allow you to translate that as free associated state, because they are not a state, they are not independent, they are a commonwealth. Now, all individuals born in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens, they're issued a United States passport, they pay federal taxes, and they use U.S. currency. Citizens vote in the primaries, however, they do not vote in the presidential elections. And they have a member in the House of Representatives. That member has a voice and not a vote. So, when Hurricane Maria hit the island in 2017, I noticed that there was a problem. FEMA request forms are the same for all United States citizens, but Puerto Ricans were being denied aid that was awarded to mainland citizens after Hurricane Harvey. So this to me raised the question, why were they denied this assistance, and what is true U.S. citizenship? So my research questions are, how do U.S. citizens request FEMA assistance after a natural disaster? What is the process for citizens to request assistance, and in what ways does FEMA respond to those requests? I also asked, what are the cultural disparities between the FEMA assistance awarded to Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria and FEMA assistance awarded to individuals on the U.S. mainland after Hurricanes Harvey, Ike, Rita, Katrina, and others? This research is part of a larger study on FEMA and actor network theory in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, because I'm also studying all the various moving parts that have to do with that hurricane that went through, and all the problems that happened because of it. I'll start with a literature review, a brief overview of technical communication and documentation theory. Then I will cover the events of Hurricane Maria in September 2017. I'll give some samples of FEMA documentation describing benefits available to all citizens of the United States. And I will present a little bit of my methods, which were interviews with Hurricane Harvey survivors from the US and interviews with Hurricane Maria survivors from Puerto Rico. And I will also do a bit of analysis of long-form reporting after Hurricane Maria. Hughes in 2002 stated that documentation and communication practices add value to an organization. And I state that this construction of knowledge, when they add organizational knowledge, is an integral part of government interaction in a democratic society and foundational to communication skills that form part of the many ways government agencies operate. Now, in these many ways the government agencies operate, Robert Reich stated that there are categories of work in the modern day work categories, and they are problem solving, problem identifying, and strategic brokering. And this is very important because the strategic brokering is the ways that documentation practices must be carried out in useful and meaningful ways for the general public. In 1989, the National Research Council was charged with studying risk communication within the U.S. government. And they noted that documentation, broadly conceived, will address the questions decision makers must face, such as what resources are available for risk communication, how they should be adjusted for relevant populations, and why these adjustments should be made. And they argued for the movement of information and creation of knowledge in a manner that is understandable by the general public. Now, Johnson Ilola stated in 1996 that technical communication work must be examined, and it is time to rethink documentation in terms of Robert Reich's symbolic analytic work, which mediates between the functional necessities of usability and efficiency, while not losing sight of the larger rhetorical and social context in which users work and live. And I think it's very important to keep in mind the idea of context, because documentation can address all sorts of problems, but then the context can change, and the documentation practices have to change with it. Hart-Davidson also discussed the work patterns of technical communicators in the past and argued that more modern technical communication practitioners, in fact, do little writing, and now they do more information design and content management. So documentation practices in risk communication and assessment then is produced by technical communicators who have been identified as workers who, one, must identify, solve, and broker issues surrounding risk assessment, and two, they must produce documentation that is usable for the population for which it is intended. One example of a population that must use documentation is medical practitioners. Opel and Hart-Davidson observed the writing processes of a healthcare clinic, and they concluded that effective writing practices can help members of an organization better learn and work together. Lazard and Mackert wrote also that documentation practices provide affordances necessary for literacy, in this case, medical literacy. And I would add that this would be applicable to documentation practices in any context as well. So documentation should be ethically sound for all parties involved, and all parties involved would be a network of actors. Grable and Simons presented principles for a critical rhetoric of risk communication and described the risk as a web of stakeholders. So contextualization of risk assessment means that there is more ethically sound documentation practices for a vulnerable population after a natural disaster. Rice and St. Amant, when discussing cultural risk communication, predicted friction points. And they said that friction points, like an ice skating rink, has these little divots and bumps that we must go over and around in order to be able to address contextualized situation, and as well all the moving parts in that situation. So for one example, in a hurricane, you've got an inexhaustive list of moving parts, and documentation practices will go with each one of those. Now, again, I argue that these documentation practices must do some predicting. There must be some preparation beforehand, before the hurricane hits, before the fire breaks out, before the earthquake happens. Like Winston Churchill, whom Bitzer said that he went around looking for the finest hours in risk communication and assessment, ethically sound documentation practices must address these writing-related friction points before a disaster occurs. In the case of FEMA-related documentation practices, time is of the essence in the production of documentation that will communicate to various disaster situations, because disasters are no respecters of persons or time, and can, without warning, render an entire population vulnerable and powerless, as was the example of Hurricane Maria. Because on September 20th, 2019, Hurricane Maria came quickly on the tail of Hurricane Irma, which had already hit a month before and knocked out electricity for about 30,000 of the island's inhabitants. Also, a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Maria, caused the worst electrical blackout in all of U.S. history. It was a major humanitarian crisis, and the number of direct fatalities was 64. The George Washington University's statistical models put the number of indirect fatalities between 1,400 and 5,740, and they stated that the discrepancy was due to a lack of awareness of appropriate death certification practices after a natural disaster. So they placed the blame on local medical practitioners, but I ask you, how can a local medical practitioner properly report the sheer magnitude of medical cases and fatalities when they have no electricity? They're trying to attend to whoever they need to attend to with the limited resources that they have, but they got blamed for it anyway. So here's just a little bit of a picture of what happened. First, Hurricane Irma came through and hit the island, just kind of swept over it, knocked out electricity, and while they were still recovering from that hurricane, Hurricane Maria came in about the same intensity and just sat on the island for about 2 or 3 days. and left 1 million of the island's inhabitants without power. Hurricane Irma left 1 million of the island's inhabitants without power, and Hurricane Maria cut off the entire island for 2 weeks. And it took over 4 months for most of the citizens to regain running water and electricity just in the metropolitan areas. Now, here's an example of the Individuals and Households Program Unified Guidance referred to by FEMA to determine eligibility. And as you can see at the top here on the page, first of all, you have to be a U.S. citizen, a non-citizen national, or qualified alien, and fall within one of these 3 definitions. And a U.S. citizen is a person born in one of the 50 United States, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, or Northern Mariana Islands. So those are some of those territories that were part of the award in the 1898 Treaty of Paris. And then they have some other descriptions as well. And on Chapter 3, the FEMA Individuals and Households Program Guide describes how disaster survivors can apply for FEMA assistance. They just have to take out their phone and pull out the handy-dandy app and make the application. But there was no electricity for people to charge their phones. And so there was no documentation assistance available. There was no consideration for lack of electricity, and there was no consideration for technology literacy as well. So in this case, I argued that documentation practices were not ethical and sound for a vulnerable population. And the FEMA website does not state how to apply for immediate needs. And you can click on that link when I upload the PowerPoint to in the class shared folder, and you can see all the different ways that one must look through the website to try to apply for assistance. It's not easy. One of the interviews I had with a Hurricane Maria survivor, and this was a very common interview, she said, "We didn't get anything. FEMA officials came to our building and told everyone to forget about applying for assistance because we did not qualify. I applied online because I had my phone and I know how to apply on the website, but I was told I only qualified for a small business loan and a hotel room halfway across the island. I didn't even get any cash to buy food for the first couple of weeks until the ATHs, which is ATM in Spanish, were back online. All that humanitarian aid in the Coliseum was designated only for the poor. But how do you prove you're poor when everybody is in the same boat? We're on our own here." And she described to me how she had to, for weeks, walk miles to the grocery store just to get the little bit of supplies that were available in the grocery store once she could get some cash from the ATH machines. Compare that with a Hurricane Ike survivor in Houston. She discussed how they got a $2,000 check for wind damage. They went to their local U.S. representative's office because FEMA kept telling them no, they didn't give her a place to live. So she went to her local representative's office, and all of a sudden, about 2 weeks later, her mother got a FEMA trailer. And the renter across the street got $25,000 because he had renter's insurance. And the Red Cross came by every day around noon while they were working on the house and brought them sandwiches. So that is just the beginning of my research. I still have many, many more interviews to do, talk to more people. My literature review reference list is on this page. And my long-form reporting and additional references are on these next 2 pages. Thank you very much for listening and for allowing me to present my research. And I look forward to listening to everyone else's as well.